So it's important for us to talk about suicide. As many of you may know, suicide is one of the leading causes of death, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Current estimates put it at about number 10 as the top leading causes of death. And I mentioned earlier that depression could be likened to the common cold and mental illness, but depression can also be deadly. And suicide is a serious reality that's associated with depression. And when you're assessing an individual for depression, assessing for the risk and potential for suicide is a necessity. So one of the first things you want to consider when you start addressing suicidal thoughts in a person is your own self-assessment. You want to ask yourself questions like, what do I think about people who have suicidal thoughts? Another one could be, what makes me feel so uncomfortable talking about suicide? You'll find that it's very uncomfortable when you begin to ask people questions about it for some reason. And I assure you, especially for those of you who are going into hospital settings, part of their daily assessment 3 times a day is getting a mental status exam, which they are going to be asked about suicidal thoughts. So the patients are quite used to it. It doesn't feel as shocking as you may feel like it would be to ask it. And you have to ask yourself, what makes it so uncomfortable to talk about? What do I think about the act of committing suicide? Do I feel like it's, selfish? Is it scary? Maybe you've had some of your own thoughts at one point, and so it makes you feel uncomfortable even bringing it back up. You want to acknowledge some of these feelings before you go into talk about it so that you can avoid any kind of countertransference that might be there. That self-assessment may help you confront some of the myths that are out there about suicide. I think it's important for us to just mention those for a few minutes. One of the myths is that if a person is talking about it, then that probably means they're not going to do it. And in fact, it's the opposite. A lot of times we find that people that do commit suicide, they have been talking about it for some time. That's not always the case. Sometimes people just do it and there was no warning about it. But a lot of times people that are talking about it, bringing it up, they do end up completing it. Another myth is that maybe there's no way to help a person. I've heard this before, if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And that's actually just not true. Sometimes if you know about the fact that some people have been talking about it, that is the time to begin to apply some interventions and get involved. Another myth about suicide is that it's selfish, that they're only thinking about themselves. And in some ways, an argument could be made that might be true, that it's a consumption with thoughts about themselves, but it's a distorted one. When you hear a suicidal person actually look you dead in the face and say, it would just be so much better for everyone if I wasn't here, and they 100% believe it, and they feel like maybe doing it would be a helpful thing to other people. It just shows you how distorted that thought process is. Another myth is that they're attention seeking. They're just doing it to get attention. And in some ways, in some cases, that might be true. They might be trying to get attention to get someone to kind of help them. But even if it's an attention seeking gesture to get the attention, suicide could still be a real reality involved with that. Another myth is that if we bring it up, if we ask them a whole bunch of questions about it, it's almost like we're giving them the idea to do it. And that's not true. You can't necessarily implant an idea in a person for suicide just from that one question. There is some argument to say that there is an environment for it sometimes, especially in peer relationships, but an honest assessment where you're actually trying to get someone to talk to you about it does not serve to be something that sends a person to try the suicide attempt. Just asking doesn't offer the suggestion of doing it. Although suicide can affect any demographic, there are some groups that tend to have a higher risk for completed suicides. And these groups include males, because males tend to use more lethal means. They'll use a gun directly more than like an overdose. Another demographic is individuals of increasing age, maybe individuals that are getting older and facing illness or just facing older age have a tendency to have a higher risk. As far as race goes, Caucasian is still the highest incident of suicide in a race specific. And then finally, an interesting demographic is divorced men have a tendency to have a higher risk for completed suicides. In fact, this may be one of the more fatal risk factors. I have a patient that I've been seeing probably now for about 4 or 5 years. And when I got her, she had had 20 previous suicide attempts. and it's surprising. I mean, it's shocking to me when I got her, but it was almost like that suicide attempt desensitized her to the attempt of another one, and it became a way of coping with her pain. Anytime she would have pain, the immediate strategy that she would go to would be to take her own life. And so this is a real serious risk factor for people to consider. Another risk factor is a family history of suicides. It's staggering the percentage of an increase of a risk it is when a family member has committed suicide. There's some years ago, we had a patient in a day treatment program who came in to see us. He was such a wonderful young man. He had a bright future ahead of him. And in fact, he was kind of one of those patients that all the team just loved him because he was so kind and so sincere. And every one of us really connected with him. And his father had committed suicide, and so had his grandfather. And upon first admission with this patient, you would have never thought that he would have any reason to commit suicide. He was good looking, he had a great life, he had a great education, great career. And we worked with him for a really, really long time and felt really optimistic when he was discharged. And unfortunately, he ended up shooting himself 3 days after we discharged him. And it was a real impact, not just obviously for the family involved with him, but even the treatment staff. We actually had to take a day off at work so that everyone involved with his care could grieve and really just process their own feelings about it. And really probably thought that despite his risk factors, he'd gotten to a level where he was going to be okay. So this is a really, really tremendous risk factor for people if they have a family history or other people in their lives around them that had committed suicide. Another risk factor is psychiatric disorders, comorbidities. Bipolar disorder probably has one of the highest risks of suicide completion than any other psychiatric disorders. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into bipolar disorder later. Alcohol or substance use as a tremendous risk factor. A lot of that's because of just the judgment that gets impaired with the use of substance use. Physical illness, we probably hear about this even in media, people that have chronic pain or terminal illnesses obviously look forward to a life that they may feel like isn't worth living, and they're at risk for taking their own life. Any kind of childhood or adult trauma sets a person up for that. And social isolation, when you begin to see people that are pulling away from supports, that is a huge red flag, a risk factor as well. And then just overwhelming stressors. It's not uncommon, you hear in a news story about a businessman who had a great family, great life, but maybe something had happened with his business, or he'd gone bankrupt, or couldn't face his life, and you'll hear about a suicide that happens in that context. And there may be more, but these are the more prominent risk factors that you hear about suicide. Just as there are risk factors, there are protective factors as well that help an individual from acting maybe on these thoughts or impulses or feelings to harm themselves. And these are some of the most substantial protective factors. First one is some kind of cultural, spiritual, or religious belief. Many people have a belief in a community, or they have a belief, certain religious beliefs about suicide that would keep them from actually acting upon it. Maybe this idea of transcendence, or there's a greater purpose in their pain, that it's achieving them something, that there's a lesson to be learned in it. Sometimes that's an idea or thought that keeps people anchored and from doing that. Stable relationships, one of the biggest reasons that I hear from all of my patients. I have thoughts like this, but I would never do it because it would kill my parents, or it would, oh my goodness, it would destroy my wife, or I don't want my children to grow up with that in their life. I hear a lot of that. So it's a great motivation to have stable relationships, because they do tend to keep people anchored when they go through a crisis. Access to care is a protective factor. I just had one of my patients tell me last week that of the steps that she went through when she started to have these suicidal thoughts. She knew the steps to take, the people to call. She knew that she had access to mental health care if she needed it, and it was a reassurance to her to know that she knew that she had a place to go for help. Certain social supports or connectedness, having a place, like I said before, in a community, or connection to a community group, or just having the friendships in your life that maybe you already have, that you're a part of a system, not just the individual relationships, but the systems that you're a part of, work relationships, those kind of things. A sense of connection with other people tend to protect people. And then finally, like an internal sense of management through your own coping skills. And these are a lot of things that get worked out in therapy. It's actually teaching people what to do when you begin to feel desperate, to develop like an internal strategy to handle and to manage your own desperation. The people that have really strong resources with coping skills, much more so are protected from suicidal impulses. In fact, there's a theory that if people could have just waited, when they're suicidal, when the pressure hit them and it peaks, and you feel like there's just something you have to do. A lot of social scientists theorize that if you could get them to wait just a few minutes and get through that intense feeling, they probably wouldn't have acted on their suicidal thoughts. So these are certain protective factors or things we want to work with people to develop so that they have some kind of protection against this. When trying to assess if someone is at risk for imminent suicidal act, there are some warning signs to be able to look for. Do you hear people threatening or referencing to death? It'd be better off if I just weren't here. It'd feel a whole lot better, if I could just have the guts to do what I need to do. Things like that. Another thing is just a verbalization of hopelessness. Why does it matter? Does it really matter if I'm here at all? Those kind of thoughts and feelings. If you notice a sudden change in behavior with withdrawn and nonverbal behaviors that suggest that something's not quite right. Maybe an increase in substance use that's not typical for a patient. Any kind of sudden change in behavior or mood, especially to be concerned about with teenagers, young adults. And that also includes a sudden brightening of mood. Many times you'll see people that may be really depressed, really struggling, almost feeling like they're in a fight for a long time. And then all of a sudden, like almost in a dime, you see a sudden change. All of a sudden they're happy, and maybe they're giving things away and they're loving to the people around them. And it's a real drastic change. A lot of times it's because they feel like they've decided what they're going to do and they feel relief. And it's a big warning sign that needs further assessment. Suicide assessment is vital when you're assessing symptoms of depression and you begin to see some of these warning signs. It should be a part of any evaluation when depressed symptomology is assessed. And a suicide assessment is simply asking the questions that need to be asked. Are you having thoughts about ending your life? Are you having thoughts about killing yourself? Do you want to die? These are very direct questions that seem so intrusive, but are very appropriate in the context of this type of symptomology. Do you have a plan to do it? Have you researched it? Have you thought it out? Have you thought about how you would do it? Do you have the means to do it? Do you intend to do it? Have you thought about when you would do it? And these are the different parts of the suicide assessment. You want to ask about their ideation. Are you having these thoughts? Are they intrusive? Do you feel like you can't get away from them? Do you actually think you could do it? Do you have a plan? And how lethal is that plan? And that gives you a lot of information about what you need to do next. Do they have a gun in the home? Do they have access to it? Do they have pills that they've thought about taking or looked at every night and held in their hand? Do they really intend to do it? I've included some links for some safety apps and suicide assessments. And this is something you're going to explore this week when you're in your sim lab. You're going to be talking about suicide assessment and practicing this. And we will refer to it a little bit later on as well. So if you're in a hospital and you have a patient that you assess that's suicidal, one of the advantages of that is that you have a secure environment that you can control and influence. But it does activate certain considerations that you want to make sure that are in place for the patient. Most of the time, a patient will be put on a closer level of observation, meaning that they will be assessed more frequently while they're going about their activities on the unit. But a psychiatric unit is already set up for some amount of environmental safety. Most of them only have plastic utensils. Most of psychiatric patients keep the door open, or they have the staff has access to get in and out of their doors. They have jump-proof and hang-proof bathrooms, meaning that the curtain rods that are in there are situated to where they can't hang themselves from them. They Maytime, when you're on any kind of suicide precautions, what will happen is the staff will lock doors so that patients can't get into their rooms without observation or into non-patient areas. One of the reasons that patients, when they're admitted to psych units, they have a belonging search, and they also have anything that patients families or friends bring in, they also get searched as well, is because of wanting to ensure that patients are safe so that they can't harm themselves or harm anyone else. And other items that could be used that may potentially harm people would be removed. Even though these are some of the safeguards that get in place, I don't want you to think that suicides don't ever happen in psychiatric hospitals, because they do. In fact, just a couple of years ago, there was a couple of mishaps at one of the local hospitals where a patient had strangled themselves with a bed sheet, and had figured out a way to tie it around their neck and roll off of the bed, and in a way that ended up, taking their own life. And even though all of the rooms had cameras in them, it happened so subtly, and it was dark in the night that it got missed. And as a result of that, that particular hospital has increased, observation a lot more rigorously, because a lot of times when there's a certain intention to do something, there's a lot of motivation behind completing it. So you do what you can with the environment to make sure that people are safe. And if you were seeing a patient that was outpatient that began to have issues with suicidal thinking, that would be when you would institute some of the legal means that we talked about before, by initiating a commitment to the hospital. A lot of times, sometimes in an involuntary way, that may even mean bringing law enforcement into it to ensure that it happens. So a suicidal patient on a unit will need a safety plan with close observation and safety checks with frequent reassessments of their safety status. Once a patient has acted on suicidal thought, it increases the possibility that it could happen again, as we mentioned earlier. A safety plan would look like helping a patient walk through certain situations. And this could be a plan that you would do with a patient, especially upon discharge, or a patient that may be managed outpatient. And that may include things like, when I feel like this is what I'll do. So if I start to have thoughts of suicide, or if I start having these suicidal thoughts, I'm going to call this person, or I'm going to contact this, or I'm going to try this particular safety skill that I learned. And it also lists numbers of people that they could contact in that time, because the thought is in a moment of desperation, you need a plan. And if a plan is already worked out for them, this could be something that could be really helpful for them. You want medication considerations. We'll talk about this a little bit more next lecture, but there's certain even antidepressants that are a lot more fatal if overdosed on, and so you want to consider those type of things too for people if they're suicidal. Making a contract for safety. A lot of people have different ideas about this. This has been one of the interventions that has been chosen, to actually make a contract with the person to agree not to hurt themselves. And then also just allowing the patient to talk about their ambivalence. A lot of times, even though it's uncomfortable, just giving a person room to start talking about the fact that they have these frequent suicidal thoughts, the more you can normalize it in a way of kind of saying, a lot of people do struggle with this. It's not so unusual. It begins to help people realize, it's not really telling me that I'm supposed to do this. It doesn't mean that this is my fate. It just means that for some reason, this is what I do, this is where I go, and this is how I cope with my life. When you discharge a patient that's had some suicidal activity, meaning they've either thought about it or they've actually acted on it, you want to make sure that you have a careful discharge plan for them, including all the things we just talked about, but then also helping them understand their triggers and warning signs, and even making sure they have contacts with someone else to follow up with their particular struggle. Well, this concludes our lecture on suicide. We'll continue to refer to this throughout the semester. You're going to have some time this week during your sim to explore more about depression and to explore more about how to do a suicide assessment. I hope this has been helpful for you, and we will touch base again on Friday at our next lecture.